Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we have our annual review of the important highlights of PwC's 2021 Annual Corporate Director Survey. And joining us again this year to review some of the highlights is Leah Malone, who's the director with PwC's Governance Insight Center. Welcome back, Leah.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here.
It's, as I said, it's that time of the year again when this very well-respected survey is completed and announced to the public. And what makes it interesting this year, I consider it year two of two very challenging years. So I'm anxious to hear what the views are of sitting board members. So, Leah, can you share with us some of the results highlights that made an impression on you?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that really stood out to me this year, won't surprise you, surrounds ESG. You know, we can hardly have a conversation about corporate governance these days without talking about ESG. It's the number one thing that directors tell us shareholders want to discuss in shareholder engagement sessions. And I think a lot of ways it's really dominating boardroom discussions. So a couple of things that we saw this year come out of the survey. One is the way that companies are really building ESG into their strategy. So we ask directors this question about how are your companies dealing with these issues? And one of the things that we found is this year, almost 2/3 of directors say their company connects ESG to company strategy. Compared to last year, that's a 15-point increase. Now, TK, you've been around corporate governance a long time. You know, things in boardrooms don't change quickly. It's not common to see 15-point changes in survey questions year over year. So to me, it's a big indicator that the way boards and companies are thinking about ESG is really evolving and evolving pretty quickly. Another area where we saw a change related to ESG comes down to how directors are thinking about executive compensation plans. So the old adage is what gets measured gets done. So we like to ask about what types of metrics directors think are appropriate in executive compensation plans. So we ask about the non-financial metrics that you might expect to see. We saw a lot of support for the idea that things like customer satisfaction, employee safety, quality, that those should have some part in the executive compensation plans. It shouldn't just be about shareholder returns, TSR, and the like. We also saw a lot of support for the idea of diversity and inclusion goals being built into those executive compensation plans. Over half of directors told us that they would support D&I goals in the plans. Again, a big jump in just 1 year, over a 13-point increase since last year. The flip side of ESG, to me, is that even though companies and boards are kind of doing more in this area, they're digging in, they're thinking about the topic differently, directors still tell us that something's lacking in terms of board understanding of ESG issues. We like to ask directors about the expertise on their boards in a number of different areas. And what we found this year is that ESG is sort of at the bottom in terms of director expertise. Only a quarter of directors tell us that they think their board has a strong understanding of ESG risks. So something really kind of lacking there that stands out to me. The other takeaway that was kind of a highlight to me this year, or maybe a low light, comes down to director dissatisfaction. So much of the conversation in corporate governance the last couple of years has really related to board composition, board refreshment. And this year, again, we see almost half of directors saying that at least one of their fellow board members should be replaced. Almost 20% say, in fact, it's not just one director on their board that should go, it's two directors or even more. So really the sense that even with this intense focus on the idea of board composition, making sure that you have all of the right directors around the table, there's still quite a bit of work to be done in that area.
So, yeah, every year that seems to be a terribly red flag in the sense of progress being made in refreshment. In fact, up until this year, it's probably the first year we've had a flat number, although that flat number is so high that you can't expect it to get much higher. But the results, and when we get to the end of the show, we'll tell people where they can get a copy, because we're just having the chance to just scratch the surface, of this. There's a lot of great information in the results. But one of the questions that I thought was particularly interesting, Leah, was the one where you asked board members what areas did they feel that the board should focus on or spend more time on. So what did the results tell us when you saw the results of that question?
Yeah, I like this question because it's not about where is the board spending its time now. It's where does it need to spend more time and attention? So what's kind of not getting enough airtime in the boardroom? Typically, the response that we see is strategy. Directors say they always need to be spending more time on strategy. Well, this year, for the first time, something else topped the list, and it was talent management. Again, I think is reflective of the moment that we're in economically, tight labor markets, really a focus from directors saying we need to be thinking more and spending more time on talent management. The other thing that stood out to me in this question, though, asking about what needs more time in the boardroom, is that when we took apart the responses and looked at the male director responses versus female directors' responses, we saw quite a big difference. So for both sets of directors, talent management was at the top of the list. But following that, for male directors, they really wanted to spend more time on strategy and on crisis management. Female directors, on the other hand, were much more likely to say ESG needs more time and attention in the boardroom, and diversity and inclusion, obviously two of the things I mentioned earlier. So thinking about how boards are approaching their priorities as they move forward, I think that adds an interesting wrinkle for boards to work through.
That is interesting. I'm sure you guys will do more research in the future on that. But that's also why a diverse board is a good board, because you get these range of views, and it's probably healthier for the board to have those kinds of discussions. So one of the areas that I wanted to dig in a little deeper when I had a chance to look at this is the first one. There's actually two areas I want to talk about, but the first one is board assessments, or what some people called board evaluations. And this year, which is, I think, typical from the past, about 88% of the respondents felt that they had an effective process, for doing board assessments. And, I wasn't surprised by that, but I think this is the first time you asked the question about whether they could have a frank discussion. And 67% said that they felt that they had limitations to having a frank discussion. Now, I can't balance those two, because 88% can't have an effective process if you can't have a frank discussion. So I can only surmise that they were very liberal in saying we have an effective process. But the truth is, and I would think this number is higher than those that even said it, is that a lot of these processes are not giving them the opportunity to really tell it like it is. And that, to me, is a real problem with a board assessment.
I agree with you, TK. It's hard to marry up those results. We also saw more than half of directors saying it's a check the box exercise. So how do you respond to a survey and say, yes, our process is effective, but also it's a check the box exercise and we're not being frank? I think directors' expectations about what should the evaluation or assessment process look like is probably informing some of that discussion. We also asked, okay, so you do an assessment, then what? What happens with those results? And year after year, directors tell us the most common things that happen are they add expertise to the board, they shift composition of committees, and they add diversity to the board. Those are really the changes that boards are making. Very few directors say that a director is counseled as a result of the assessment process, or that a director is not renominated. So obviously that's somewhat of an extreme action to take out of an evaluation, but what's the point of the evaluation if it's not to figure out whether each of the directors around the table is contributing to the board and continues to be the right fit for the company and the board? Again, going back to the 47% saying that one director needs to go, there's clearly a bit of a mismatch between kind of the folks around the table and making sure that board composition is at its highest and best, and how assessment processes are really being used.
Yeah, and I have to surmise again that people underestimate how difficult it is when somebody internally is running the process. Okay, many chairman of the boards or lead directors ahead of the nominating committee say, "Oh, I'll just manage the process. We don't either want to spend the money or the time to have somebody do that," and that makes it difficult for people to be critical, I think, at times. And to me, that's one of the things that's reflected in the answer to that question is, I don't feel comfortable, okay, being candid with whoever is doing that process. And that, to me, is certainly a problem.
Sure. And I think you also have a great number of boards that continue to run the process on a full board or committee level versus the individual director level, which again, I think you're leaving some of the process out of the picture that would really lead to a better result. Yeah.
Now, I don't want to sound like I'm always a wet blanket, because there's plenty of positive things in this, your results that speak well of, for example, directors hearing shareholders and responding and whatever. But I do have to say that the other thing that caught my eye was in the area of improving board diversity. Obviously, this has been a huge issue. I mean, there's organizations that are withholding votes and directors that aren't getting this message. But the thing that really upset me, and maybe this is because I've done so much work in this area, but that is the percentage of people that said the reason that diversity hasn't been improving is there aren't qualified candidates. Leah, I have to tell you, I thought this was an issue that was past this 5 years ago, at least, okay, with this. There has been so many, examples where that's just not the case, that somebody's not looking hard enough. And to hear that 45% of the respondents said that was an issue for diversity, improving diversity, it's just disappointing.
Yeah, I agree with you. So let's kind of take half a step back. We asked so many questions about board diversity. It's not all a negative story. Some of it, I think, is quite positive. So first of all, one of the things that stood out to me this year, we asked directors, when you think about your next candidate, the next person you want to bring onto the board, what's the number one thing on the list that you're looking for? And what we found was that racial and ethnic diversity is number one on the list. By and far, directors tell us that that's what they're looking for in their next candidate. So that, to me, is a very strong indication of the fact that even the idea of board diversity is changing. A couple of years ago, such a strong focus on gender diversity and the thought that we really need to find more women to be serving on corporate boards. Obviously, that was true, and it resulted in some nice progress. I think that the conversation is very much shifting now towards a recognition of the really tiny percentage of directors who come from non-white backgrounds serving on corporate boards. So lots of focus there from boards. Another kind of a positive thing I would note is that we asked directors about kind of how do you think about diversity in general on boards. Last year, 71% of directors said it'll happen naturally, that over time, boards will diversify. Doesn't require a big effort from the board to make it happen. That number fell in half this year. Only a third of directors now tell us board diversity will happen naturally. Almost all directors say that their boards are taking some steps to increase their diversity now. And then when we ask about, okay, well, what do you think about diversity on boards in general? We see really strong support for the idea that it has benefits. 93% of directors tell us that board diversity brings unique perspectives into the boardroom. 85% say it enhances the performance of the board itself. So a real strong recognition that board diversity has benefits to the board, to the company as well. On the flip side, going to what you mentioned, we did see more than half of directors saying that board diversity is driven by political correctness. And then you see fairly large percentages saying that board diversity is resulting in the nomination of unneeded or unqualified candidates. To the point that you mentioned earlier, TK, we also asked about, why aren't boards diversifying more quickly? If you tell us board diversity has benefits, you tell us you're focused on it, you're making changes, why isn't it happening faster? And that's where the number one response was that they're just not finding qualified candidates. Now, I agree with you that I think maybe there's a bit of a pipeline issue, but that perhaps more than that, it's really a search issue, and that directors and boards don't have the right criteria to find the directors that they need, especially given the fact that they're prioritizing racial and ethnic diversity, which I agree with. The idea that they still can't find the candidates is very dispiriting, and it makes you wonder exactly how those search processes are being run, especially because, as you mentioned, you and I know that there are plenty of qualified candidates out there who would really bring a lot to these public company boards.
Well, and on a positive note, we just finished a previous show where Spencer Stewart's study said that 72% of Fortune 500 companies year to date have placed a woman or an ethnic minority into their open position. Okay, that has to be the highest number that we've ever seen, and over time, okay, that will certainly affect the number. The other thing that was in your survey results was there isn't a lot of turnover. We don't have any spots. Well, it is so easy to create additional spot on your board if nobody's retiring, and expand your board by one, add somebody, and then just peel that back when somebody retires. So there's still, I'm sure that the boards are doing it, but I hope they're doing it for the right reasons, okay? And not just the pressure or that somebody's going to vote against me, because some of this research would suggest that, they're doing it, but they're doing it reluctantly. And that's, we never want that to be the way that these things happen. There's a reason that this makes sense, as some of your research shows. And some of the numbers just sort of give us just a feeling that people are doing it, but some people are dragging their feet. So how about, Leah, we have, a couple minutes left. Anything else that you'd like to share with our audience that you thought was significant that, might be interesting before we tell them where they can get a copy of the whole survey?
Yeah, sure. It's not lost on me that a couple of years ago, we used to do this in person. We would sit together in the same room and have this discussion. And now for the second year, we're doing this from our homes, hundreds of miles apart. This is obviously a reflection of the way many people are working today and the way that many boards are operating. Many directors do tell us that their boards are starting to come back to meeting in person where they can. I think that was a little bit more common over the summer, has pulled back a little bit this fall, to be determined what will be the course for the next couple of months in terms of getting together in person. But one of the things that we asked about in the survey was, what is the impact of these virtual meetings? How are you thinking about the impact of that on your board, and what are the effects that you see? You won't be surprised to hear that directors tell us meetings are more efficient. Of course they are. No one's traveling to be together. It's much faster and easier to sign on from your home than to, for example, take a flight across the country. But that's really the only area where they see a net positive impact. Some of the areas that were quite negatively impacted were meeting effectiveness. Okay, so our meeting is efficient. It takes less time than it used to, but it's simply not as effective. The conversation isn't as robust. We're not getting to the areas that we want to get to. People's voices aren't being heard in the same way. We heard that director engagement is down. Again, not surprising. Folks calling in or signing on to video from their homes, they're simply not as engaged as they are when they're in the room together. And importantly, board culture is suffering. 61% of directors tell us that virtual meetings have a negative impact on board culture. Now, that's one of those questions that I think begins to overlay everything that we've talked about, and in particular, the diversity discussion we were just having. When you think about making changes on the board, bringing new folks in, thinking about the future of the board and who should be sitting on the board and filling those board seats, ensuring that you have a strong board culture where each director feels they can voice dissent, ask questions, that they feel that their impact is crucial to the board. That's something that I think boards need to be thinking about very carefully, especially in this moment of having fewer in-person interactions and making sure that they, even though people have gotten comfortable with this technology, that they're using it to their benefit and that they're not letting the negative impacts of the technology kind of overtake the positive, efficiencies.
Well, and all the directors that I've talked to, I won't be surprised if they end up with some sort of 50-50 deal where half the meetings are face-to-face and the other half are virtual. They have found out that virtual is possible. That's one thing that they have. But I would agree with you on every point that you've made, relative to that. I worry about all those things and certainly orientation of a new director from, as a virtual can't possibly be as good as, having them have the opportunity to meet people face to face and understand who their peers are. So that's an interesting note. And I would agree with, again, all the results that you offer the highlights on. So, this is a great survey and it's much more in depth than we were able to cover, Leah. So where can people get and read a full copy of the full survey results?
Yep. So the report is available on our website. For the Governance Insight Center, you can download the report. You can read over our take on all of the findings. And we also include in the appendix all of the answers to every question that we asked. So lots of data to dig into for you.
Well, I want to thank you once again. This is as comprehensive as I think we've ever been on reporting out on this. But I want to thank you for taking the time and joining me and passing along this good information.
Always a pleasure, TK.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.